yourself feeling exposed about something true about yourself that's difficult to see? When we hear a question like this, many of us may tend to think of being exposed by a shortcoming or a failing of some sort. And yet sometimes we feel exposed by something lovely about us too. Maybe that something lovely can feel difficult to believe or receive. And either way, in either direction, that dissonance between how we see ourselves and where the truth is, if it's an idealized version of ourselves or the reality, or even if it's a lower version of ourselves and reality, either way, when we see and feel that dissonance, sometimes our response to that is to hide or deny or dismiss or shut down or attack or blame whatever or whomever may have exposed us. If the dissonance is tolerable, we can receive the truth and even grow. So in today's passage in Matthew chapter 10, Jesus is talking about exposing our hearts and revealing how our response to that leads to either life or death. And yay, the Christ Pantocrator is up on our screen today, and I want to draw your attention to it. This icon is very, very old, Byzantine era. And I've always been drawn to this, even though really in some ways it's uncomfortable to look at because it's not symmetrical. Jesus' face is not symmetrical, but it's on purpose. And it's really because in some ways, some people interpret this as showing the dissonance between things that we see in Jesus. So some have seen on the left-hand side Jesus' humanity, and on the right-hand side Jesus' divinity. Some people have combined attributes of God when they look at this. And they see on the right-hand side mercy or compassion or grace, and even his hand is in the symbol of peace. And then when they look on the right side, they think of like justice and truth. And he's holding, some people say that's the law, the book of the law, but because it has the cross on it, some people call it the book of the gospel. Either way, there's a coming together of opposing things in Jesus, and he holds them together. And honestly, we kind of like to separate these things. It's almost easier for us to notice mercy or notice truth. It's hard to hold, especially even mercy and justice together. I think of Micah 6:8, where he says, what God requires of us is to love justice, to do justice, and to love mercy, and to walk humbly with our God. And when you wrap all of those three things together, it's really kind of difficult to hold those together in our nature. So this is a picture of Jesus that I kind of want us to kind of like hold and keep in the background today as we kind of listen to this difficult message. And I show you this also because since Jesus is saying dissonant things, we just really want to listen to them. When I was looking at this for the first time, when I was kind of looking at this passage in light of the other passages, I was really focused on the hard saying that Jesus says when he says, I have not come to bring peace but a sword. And yet the other statements in here are equally difficult to hear. Like when he tells us that he's going to set man against father and daughter against mother and so on in relationships. And that the enemies will be a part of their household experience. And that whoever loves father and mother more than me is not worthy of me. Oof, that feels heavy to hear. And what does it mean? Whoever finds his life will lose it, and whoever loses his life for my sake will find it. I'm really thankful for Vespers because we're invited to, as we listen to the scriptures there, we're invited to not only look at what is like shining for us, but also what is like distressing or uncomfortable. what questions we have. And I'll say that, because I grew up hearing, especially this last verse, whoever finds his life will lose it, and whoever loses his life for my sake will find it. It's easy for me to be like, yeah, I know, I kind of get that, and then move on, right? And just be like, I don't know what Jesus is saying, so I don't know that I'm going to really sit there very long. I'm just going to move on by. And I think, it's tempting, when we see Jesus saying things that are uncomfortable to hear. And we're kind of like, what? This doesn't totally match up with how I want to see Jesus or how I think Jesus is. What can he be saying? We can be tempted to defend him. We can tend to in our defense, make bullet points and craft debates to get people to believe certain things. But I really appreciate, and I want to remind you of something that Pastor Scott beautifully said 2 weeks ago. He said, Jesus is not a set of beliefs to be agreed or argued with, but a person to be trusted. And that's what we're doing in ordinary time. This is a season of ordinary time in our church calendar, and we're learning how do we more deeply trust Jesus. And so we want to be curious a little bit here today. What is he saying about himself? And how does what he is saying help us to know him as a person to be trusted? So when Jesus says, I have not come to bring peace but a sword, he is not saying that he is bringing violence or war. When I was looking at pictures, even to kind of put on the screen for art, it was a little alarming, some of the pictures that come up for this verse. I think it would really be inconsistent with everything else we see about Jesus to think he is saying that he is wanting to bring violence or war, especially against people. If he's interested in violence, then he would have allowed James and John, who are called the sons of thunder, to rain down fire from heaven on people like they wanted to, but he didn't allow them to do that. And even in Gethsemane, when he's being arrested, one of the disciples whips out a sword and cuts off the ear of the servant of the high priest. And Jesus doesn't say, hey, keep going, let's battle this out, right? He says, put your sword away. And he heals the servant. This statement, I have not come to bring peace but a sword, actually calls to mind another time that a sword is mentioned in the Gospels. It calls to mind Simeon's prophecy to Mary when Jesus was a newborn. So just to remind you what was happening there, when Joseph and Mary bring Jesus to the temple in Jerusalem to present him to the Lord according to the law of Moses regarding firstborn sons, there was a righteous man there. He was righteous and devout, and his name was Simeon. And he was waiting for the Messiah to come. And the Holy Spirit had told him that he would not see death before he saw the Lord's Messiah. So upon entering the temple, Simeon noticed Jesus and was drawn to him by the Holy Spirit. And he took Jesus in his arms and blessed God. And he also blessed Jesus' parents. And he said specifically to Mary, and here's where we go, here's the connection. Behold, this child is appointed for the fall and rising of many in Israel, and a sign for what is opposed, and a sword will pierce through your own soul also, so that the thoughts of many hearts be revealed. So we recognize in this blessing to Mary a foreshadowing of her participation in the suffering of Jesus and the pain that she must have felt as his mother while remaining near him as he was crucified. Kenneth Bailey, who was a Presbyterian minister, and he was an author and lecturer in Middle Eastern New Testament studies, and he lived and taught in Middle Eastern countries for 40 years. And so he was well acquainted with Middle Eastern customs. And in his book, Jesus Through Middle Eastern Eyes, he notices Simeon's foreshadowing, and he has some perspective about what is happening here, about the thoughts being revealed in people's hearts. So he says this: around the cross flows a river of compromise. Everyone is strangely exposed. Maybe I need to stop moving. All right. Okay. Around the cross flows a river of compromise. Everyone is strangely exposed. The disciples believe, but in their fear they run away. Peter makes bold promises, but falls into denial. The high priest wants to preserve the sanctity of the temple and keep the Romans from intervention in his sacred space. In the process, he participates in the death of an innocent man. The soldiers only obey orders, and those orders violate Roman justice. Pilate wants to stay out of trouble. He's presumably scared lest the temple authorities send a message, it's like a negative report to Caesar about him that would clearly damage his career. The thoughts and the hearts of many were revealed by the cross, and Mary participated in that suffering. On Golgotha, Mary chose to remain to the end and witness the suffering of her son until death. She was not under arrest and could have walked away. She knew that she couldn't change anything that was happening. She couldn't argue with the soldiers or plead with the high priest. The only decision she had that she was free to choose was to remain and enter into Jesus' suffering. Indeed, a sword passed through her heart, and in the process, she became a model for Christian discipleship. Will Mary's faithful presence at the cross oblige evil forces around her to look at themselves and contrast their brutality and her courageous love? This contrast is interesting. Exposure shows us what is actually in our hearts and what we love the most. And this word, when Jesus is saying, whoever loves father, mother more than me, this word love here in verse 37 is phileo in the Greek, which is often used in reference to relational affection and friendship, and can be used for whatever we are attached to. It kind of has an attachment kind of language to it. So one example where it's also used is when Jesus says of the Pharisees that they love their seats of honor and special greetings. So the Pharisees are very attached to their reputation and their position. Another example here, though, is when it's used when the people are responding to Jesus weeping over Lazarus with Mary, when Lazarus dies, when they say, see how he loved them. So we can see that when Jesus says, whoever loves father or mother more than me is not worthy of me, he's talking about the attachments of our hearts, whether that's in our relationships or, and then when he's also talking about whoever loses his life will find it, and whoever loses his life will find it, he's talking about the attachments that we have to the things that we make our life about. So I want to talk a little bit about attachment, in case you're unfamiliar with human attachment. But Kurt Thompson is a psychologist, and he said that when we are born, we are looking for someone who is looking for us. When we are born as humans, we require connection in order to survive, and we require connection from our caregivers. Most animals have instincts where they start to not need their caregivers very soon, pretty quickly. Some animals are even born walking, but it takes us at least around a year or so to walk. And we need caregiving for a long time compared to animals. Animals have instincts that develop relatively quickly. We have barn swallows in our back porch that are probably, they matter of days or a week and they're gone, from the nest. But the process for us becoming mature is much slower. And connection with caregivers The connection that we have with our caregivers affects how we experience the world around us and our relationships. When we're born, we can't regulate our nervous system on our own. When we feel distress of any kind, we need our caregiver's nervous system to be calm and to soothe us from any distress that we're feeling. And when our caregiver responds to us in a predictable way, and we start to learn how to trust that our needs are going to be met and that we are secure in the world, we recognize that our distress gets comforted by the predictability and things like that about our caregiver. We learn that we're not on our own and that we don't have to be on our own. We learn that we are liked and that we are loved when our needs are responded to. We learn who we are as we're learning to trust. We feel the emotions that our caregivers have, and we mirror these things back and forth. And as we grow and expand in our abilities, we feel secure enough to go and explore and come back, and we kind of have this back and forth relationship with our caregivers. Now, this is a very, very, very simple explanation of attachment, but just to give you kind of an idea of what I'm talking about. Now, attachment can be disrupted when caregivers' needs impact their ability to meet the needs of a child in a predictable way. It really impacts the way that child understands what the world is like, whether the world can be trusted, whether they can trust people. And their feeling of safety in relationships and in the world is severely impacted. And so much more could be said about this. But for our purposes, just really wanted to emphasize that attachment is good. We were created to need it, and it's very natural. I also want to bring up that when it comes to the way that we start to even move into the world as we grow and as we mature, Nouwen points out there's kind of Henry Nouwen, if you don't know him, he's priest and professor, Catholic priest and professor. He points out that there's 3 main categories or themes that might describe kind of how we're tempted to build our lives. And in fact, some of these things are really quite natural and quite good, but we build our lives based on what we do and what people say about us and what we have or what we possess. And these things really relate to the temptations of Jesus. And that the temptations were about grasping for ourselves. It really goes back to the garden. In the garden, we decided to try to be like God without being in relationship with God. And so some of the ways that we are tempted to be like God without being in relationship with Him and being dependent on Him are by creating what we do. And in ultimate ends, if we kind of only can be known or loved or feel safe in the world by being successful and achieving, that has its own kind of destructive end. Or if we're so reliant on what people think of us and our reputation, that can go to a pretty negative end as well. And same with what we have or what we don't have. And we see in Jesus that in His temptations, He actually overcomes these things. And He overcomes them partially because he recognizes that He is so beloved by God, because God actually says this to Him right before He takes Him into the wilderness in these 40 days. And so Nouwen says that the more that we kind of can recognize this belovedness that we have in God, this connection that we have to God, that God actually loves us and desires us, everything we kind of sang about today, He made us, He loves us, He wants us. That as we take this in and can really bring this in more and more, it kind of cuts through these things we build our life around. And these things we build our life around start to be less and less potent, less and less something that we have to have in order to feel secure, in order to feel okay. his belovedness somehow mysteriously as we receive it just cuts through that over time. And this is a process, and I think that's important, is that this is a process. This isn't something that happens quickly. It's something that happens a lot, often, over time. And the way that we notice it is by being exposed to where we don't have that belovedness. Isaiah's passage in particular, where God is saying like that he is going to bring the lofty low, right? He is going to take the lofty pride of men, that it'll be humbled. I think that's what exposure feels like. It feels like being brought low. It feels like a little bit of a piercing to our hearts. And I think that what it's important to recognize is that judgment is not about destroying us. And he wants to bring Israel low so that they can understand what they're missing out on in God's belovedness of them. He's not trying to destroy us, but to destroy the things that are destroying us.
Say that again.
So, what if we were so much more attached to God than anything else? What would that look like? Yeah. What do we do when he exposes our priority of attachment? When he reveals where we find our life and don't want to lose it, but we want to grasp it instead of holding it open? What do we do when he reveals that maybe we love the attachments that we have to other people or things more than him? What do we do with that? Gregory Boyle is a Jesuit priest, and he worked, I'm not sure if he's still alive or not. He was dealing with cancer. But anyway, he works out in Los Angeles with Latino gangs. But early on in his priesthood, he was working his first year as a priest in Bolivia, and he was there to learn Spanish. And he said that time changed him forever. He said that he could do the Mass in English pretty, like he could do it off the cuff if he needed to. He knew it that well. But in Spanish, not so much. That was a lot harder because he was new to Spanish. And while he was there in Bolivia, there was a group of Quechua Indians that were living up in the mountains, and what they did is they harvested flowers for market, cut flowers for market. And he was asked by some of the health workers that were ministering to them up there if he would come and say the Mass, and somebody else would preach in Quechua, but he would say the Mass in Spanish for them. And they hadn't had a priest come to that area for a decade. So it would be really important, just unique for them to get to experience that. And so he said yes, and as he was on the open truck going up the mountain, he looked through his backpack and realized that he didn't have his missalette that had the words of the Holy Communion. So, if you're not acquainted with Roman Catholic, like when I first read this, I kind of got the context, but it would be as if Pastor Scott said, "Would you do communion?" And he said, "Sorry, I don't have the book. I don't have the words." And you had to kind of remember what the words are as you lead people through it. It'd be like that, only in a different language. Right? So he's scrambling, flop sweats, he says, as he's riding this way up, and he's searching his Spanish Bible, looking for anything that looks like it might be words that are part of Holy Communion that he's going to lead, right? And he gets there, and there's hundreds of Quechuan Indians there waiting for him, really looking forward to this. And somebody else does the homily, and he gets up to say the words, and he just really butchers it. He does the best that he can, but he knows he's not saying the things. And he feels humiliated, as you can imagine, you might. And so afterwards, one of the health workers brings over to him somebody who hasn't had confession for 10 years. And so she's half an hour speaking to him in Quechuan, just unloading, bearing her soul. And he, kind of gives the response that's typical back to her, feeling really deflated. And when he's done with her, he looks up and everyone's gone. Even his ride back to town, down the mountain, is gone. So he is just feeling totally deflated and alone. And out of nowhere, this old campesino comes up to him, and he looks so weathered. He's old, and his wrinkles are everywhere, and his clothes are tattered and rough from wear and work. And he comes up to Gregory and he says, Tatia, which is Quechua for padrecito, a word packed with cariño affection, a charming intimacy. He looks up at me with penetrating, weary eyes and says, Tatia, gracias por haber venido. Thanks for coming. I think to say something, but nothing comes to me, which is just as well, because before I can speak, the old campesino reaches into his pockets of his suit coat and retrieves 2 fistfuls of multicolored rose petals. He's on the tips of his toes and gestures that I might assist him in the inclination of my head. And so he drops the petals over my head, and I'm without words. He digs into his pockets again and manages 2 more fistfuls of petals. He does this again and again, and the store of red and pink and yellow rose petals seem infinite. I just stand there and let him do this, staring at my own pants, now moistened with my tears, covered with rose petals. Finally, he takes his leave, and I'm left there alone with only bright aroma of roses. For all the many times I would return to that place and see the villagers over and over, I never saw that old campesino again. God, I guess, is more expansive than every image we think to make of him. God, how much greater is God than the one that we think we have? More than anything else, the truth of God seems to be about joy that is a foreigner to disappointment and disapproval. That joy doesn't know what we're talking about when we focus on the restriction of not measuring up. That God is the one who is greater, who only has on his mind what it is to drop endlessly rose petals on our heads. Behold the one who can't take his eyes off of you. Marinate in the vastness of that. And I bring up this story because it just really illustrates that when we are exposed, when we feel exposed and cut by what we feel like is not measuring up, Jesus wants to enter in there with so much more kindness and so much more love and attachment to us than we actually maybe even think could be possible. Before he tells this story, he says that Richard Rohr says that nothing of our humanity is to be discarded. He also goes on to say that no part of our hard wiring or our messy selves is to be disparaged. Where we stand in all our mistakes and imperfection is on holy ground. when the vastness of God meets the restriction of our humanity, words can't hold it. The best we can do is to find moments that rhyme with this expansive heart of God. And so what if God is more attached to us than we think? What if he, like a good parent, is attuned to our needs, is looking at us? That when we come into the world looking for someone looking for us, he is actually looking right at us before we can even know. And that all of the, I tend to do this with my hands. All of the lack of being seen, the lack of maybe being valued in our world by our parents, maybe even, that we try to solve ourselves in how we order our lives, are met with his love. And that he wants us to see that those things can't really meet his attachment love. And so when he says this, as hard as that may sound, and maybe even as foreign as it may sound in our passage today, when he is saying, whoever loses his life for my sake will find it, maybe I wonder if he's saying, what if you don't have to work that hard to be loved? What if you don't have to work that hard to be valued? I have it already for you. And when you give up those ways of trying to receive it yourself, you will find it in me. Like rose petals falling over us. And I think that's what's happening in Romans 6, right? When he is saying that we die with him and we also raise with him. That's a picture of what this is, what this looks like, what this means in our lives. And I don't know what those things are for you. I know what they are for me. So, 2 more things as I wrap up. There's an attachment experiment that I really loved seeing. It was so amazing to me. Back in, when you're in undergrad, actually, seeing about attachment and learning these psychological things, there was this experiment that they did with babies and mothers. And what it was is they had a table that had plexiglass on top of it, but it expanded past the table. So there was kind of this cliff that the baby could see. And they would put the baby on the table with the plexiglass, and the mother would stand across the gap on the other side and call the baby to itself. And of course, the baby starts to crawl and then sees the cliff. And it's not really there, but it looks like it's there, right? And so what they noticed is that in babies who did not have that attachment trust, who did not have the predictability of their caregiver, they would not cross. They would not go. But crazy as it may be, and as high courage as this is for a little one, the babies who had a trusting relationship would get to the edge and they would doubt. They would go, what? Like we do with this passage, what? But they would come. They would take that leap and they would crawl to across. And so it just reminds me that when we start to really know and trust and experience God's attachment love for us, it's almost like the verse that says, perfect love casts out fear is true, right? We see that in that little baby's courage to just crawl across to nothing, what looks like death to it, right? To be received. And so one more thing I want to notice about Mary as she is at the cross with Jesus is that as she's there and as she's witnessing her son, I'm not even a mother, but I'm imagining like what that must be like to feel like you are losing your son, right? Watching your son being tortured. But I think what's happening there and the reason why she can leap is because I just wonder, I can't know for sure, but I wonder if she is no longer possessive of him as her son, but if she is starting to be attached to him as the triune God. And that allows her to stand there. And maybe we're invited into that too. That kind of steady attachment to God. Let's pray.